All right, let's do one that I really enjoy. I mean, I enjoy a lot of the stuff that we discuss, but this one's fun. So we're going to talk about something that's going to bring in a lot of the stuff that we've talked about this semester so far. And I'm finally going to discuss Phineas Gage, somebody that I've gestured at discussing for a while, but this time we're finally going to spend some time on him. We're going to talk about certain damage that could occur and what that might tell us. A hypothesis that was developed in the 90s by Antonio Damasio on the relationship between the mind and the body, and then potential evidence for that. So relevant background here from the previous videos are going to be a little bit of the history videos, right? So Descartes' idea that the mind and body are fundamentally separate, but then later ideas in phrenology, which came up again in the modularity discussion, that there might be independent and separate mental aspects. Also, the idea that we have certain irrationalities to us that can be predictable and observable. And from the previous lecture, that there might be aspects of our cognition that are more bodily than we had thought. Okay, so this is Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad foreman in the 1800s who made a mistake when he was tamping down an iron. These are these giant things. He's holding one in his hand in that picture. He looked the wrong way as his hammer went down. And what they were doing at the time was trying to nail down railroads. And these railroad spikes went really, really deep into the ground. And they had to use dynamite to blast through. Well, actually not dynamite, sorry. Dynamite is invented to make this safer. They had to use explosive powder, TNT, to break through the ground, basically. So he makes a mistake, looks away at the wrong moment as his hammer swings down, and this tamping iron goes all the way, shoots out with huge force and goes straight through his skull. The crazy part about this is that he gets up almost immediately, and he's got a giant hole, a couple of giant holes in his head. So they take him to a doctor right away. The doctor is able to help him heal, fight off an infection that develops, and then starts keeping track of him for basically the rest of his life. The story that we're told is that Gage was a really hard worker, really organized, really good at his job, and afterwards he became a bit of an asshole, crude, unable to care, just uncaring, forgetful. He ended up having to make a living essentially as a sideshow on a traveling circus, on Barnum and Bailey's traveling circus. So it's a famous case, and people have been fighting about it for years, and we've reconstructed roughly where the damage was. But we know that he had some frontal lobe damage. And so we've seen people that have had frontal lobe damage before. The frontal lobe is, we think, the most recently evolved section of our brain that's involved in a lot of our long-term offline cognition, a lot of our planning. And people that have damage here, which we could have quite a few of them because in the early 1900s, we decided that this was a way of dealing with all sorts of emotional issues, is just to drill random holes into your head. just stick an ice pick in there and wiggle it around for a bit. People that had this procedure would have normal IQs in regular tests, but they tended to have some difficulty with reasoning, planning, emotions, some poor mental flexibility, a phenomenon of perseveration, which is this continuing to work on a problem even after it stops being useful for them or helpful, lack of control of their emotions, that kind of thing. Okay, so we've had quite a few patients of those, and the one patient in particular that drew Antonio Damasio's attention was this patient he called Elliot, who had an orange-sized tumor removed from his frontal lobe. Elliot was a high-ranking professional who was charming and had a great memory, and he kept those after his operation. But he started losing job after job after job, getting married and divorced very quickly, went bankrupt in some really shady schemes that he should have been able to see through, ended up having to live with his brother. So many studies on him showed that he had a pretty intact logic, memory, and attention, but had a real hard time accessing his own emotions, planning, making decisions, figuring out how to behave. Like he would go into his office and instead of doing the work he had to do, would spend hours cataloging or measuring the tiles or whatnot, which is something that we all do to a certain extent, but he had never done it before and couldn't really stop now. Damasio became acquainted with lots of other patients that also had some similar issues with sarcasm, irony, deception, lots of these social cues. They could be random, they could be impulsive, they could get derailed very quickly, lost in thought. So Damasio looked at the surgery report and concluded that there was some damage, some ties that had been severed between the neocortex and the amygdala, right? So the part of the brain that we tend to associate with higher order cognition and the part of the brain we tend to associate with more emotional aspects. This is reminiscent, and I'll tell you why this is relevant. Centuries before, somebody had proposed the view that humans make decisions when there is something that is that breaks the tie, and if there was a perfect tie, you couldn't make a decision, right? And so the idea being that you would imagine a donkey that was perfectly equidistant from two bales of hay would starve to death because there was no rational decision to choose one over the other. So this was supposed to be an objection, a reductio ad absurdum, which is a philosophical style of argument where you take a view to a contradiction of a view that our reasoning must be based purely on there being some benefit or drawback. And so Buridan's ass shows that reason by itself doesn't decide between things. That in fact, there has to be something else. Maybe a coin flip, or maybe, as Antonio Damasio suggests, emotion is going to come into play. Emotion is what Elliot was missing, according to Damasio. Him being unaware of his own feelings made him insist on finding a rational decision when there was none to be found, and so he could easily spend infinite time until basically he passed out trying to solve problems. That emotion actually played a more central role in our decision making and even our rational decision making than we had thought. So maybe I'll present that in this video and then leave the evidence to the next video. The somatic marker hypothesis, somatic from the Greek soma for bodily, is the idea that there's some bodily states that are going to play an important role in decision making. So in a certain sense, your mind links certain bodily perceptions and experiences with certain shortcuts. And so every time you face future decisions like that, you will make the same sort of decision that you did the first time. It's a way of very quickly being able to process. So if you're playing chess, you might think it's purely rational, but sorry, I'm playing a lot of chess recently. You might think that your decisions are purely rational, but there's a point where you just start feeling genuinely wary of where to look. You make mental shortcuts, and your body tells you to be aware of like a particularly precarious piece. And the same for every other decision that you make. So the idea is that the bodily changes that you make are helping constrain the sort of answers that are going to be appropriate for you. This discussion of a problem space. Think about when you're facing a problem, there literally is an infinite number of solutions to most problems, but you have to make one decision. And if there's not an obvious choice, as in the donkey facing the 2 bales of hay, sometimes your body will just choose one. When in doubt, go left or something. So central to this is this zone here, this ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that's going to be the connection between the neocortex and the amygdala. The idea in the somatic marker hypothesis is that the signal is going to travel from the amygdala to the neocortex, and there's this kind of a feedback loop where your reasoned decisions give you an emotional response and vice versa. So that you can learn via not just reasoning, but emotions are going to start playing a role too. So your body will receive input in some exposure situations, and then you will think about it like that from that point forward. You will not necessarily have to even experience the same thing again. It's not immediately obvious how central your body, the direct constant feedback is. Maybe if you've experienced things in your past that permanently changes your brain, or maybe you need a constant reinforcement. Possibly both, depending on the circumstances. There's one task that we'll talk about called the Iowa gambling task that I've played with my friends with mixed results. I trust the people that did the study were doing it with greater, they're doing it with more of their friends, or more than just their friends, and so it was under greater control. But the basic idea is there's 4 decks of cards. A and B give you great payoffs early on, but the penalties are also pretty severe, and they're uncommon enough that they will eventually you will get them, and you'll eventually lose if you keep drawing from decks A and B. But C and D give you more modest but regular gains, and the costs are relatively rare. And so, so the idea is that people will eventually learn to choose C and D if they have a normal functioning brain. But it turns out that patients that have the ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage continue to select cards from A and B, while normal controls sample from all of the decks at first and then gradually start moving to C and D. And in fact, they start hesitating more before drawing cards from A and B once they get the really big negative payoffs. There's like a skin conductance response. So it's like their body is processing that it's risky to choose A and B before their mind realizes it. So the idea then is that maybe this is what, maybe these this people that have this particular kind of brain damage show a phenomenon that's happening in all of our cognition. That when we find situations that we've roughly encountered before, the VMVFC can reactivate certain patterns. And these accumulate over time, and they're incorporated in bodily perceptions, bodily feelings. You might call them gut feelings. These are bodily issues, right? So somatic markers. You mark a decision as good or bad, and you might not even necessarily have to be aware of it. Sometimes you just have a bias against certain behaviors. And the important thing to realize here is, as with the illusion of rational thought, maybe rationality isn't that rational itself. Maybe it's always been tainted by emotion. Okay. You know what? I could probably make this all one single video. All right. So we saw the Iowa gambling task as evidence for the somatic markers. Patients, so it turns out that even people with brain damage, with this VMPFC brain damage, would exhibit the same sort of response, skin conductance response. Your skin gets tingly when you're startled, when you're spooked. Bah! For example. Hopefully your skin all got tingly there. But this scary phenomenon, or scary things, or emotionally evocative stimuli also produce the response to emotion, or sorry, a skin conductance response among normal patients, whereas VMPFC patients did not. So the startle response created the skin conductance startling created a skin conductance response in all patients, but emotionally evocative stimuli did not create the response in patients that had the VMPFC damage. This is just the results from the Iowa gambling test study that I showed in the previous section. Okay, so what do we have so far? It seems like there's pretty strong evidence that there is a particular kind of damage that affects your skin conductance. Does that mean that emotion is involved in all reasoning? Not necessarily. Because it turns out that you can interpret the data in a variety of ways. There's not an immediate link between the Iowa gambling task and all other decision making and all other emotion. It's not immediately obvious that somatic markers are going to be the kind of thing that will explain all of these phenomena. And even the VMPFC patients could be aware, like they can introspect, they can change their behavior, which seems to undermine some of this research, right? It seems like they could learn if they thought about it. So the fact that there's brain damage that has some effects is not necessarily the issue. All right, that's it.